This is In Studio. I'm Jay Daniels. I had the pleasure recently of interviewing Chris Brubeck. Chris is the son of legendary pianist Dave Brubeck, and along with his brother Dan, Chris tours the country with the Brubeck Brothers Quartet. And during this interview, we're not only going to talk about his father's legacy, but also how he and the quartet are continuing that legacy. You might hear a few interesting stories along the way. Here's Chris Brubeck.
So I was more of a rock generation kind of person, but I recognized that what Dave did was so significant in that compared to everything else going on, it was as original to jazz as Are You Experienced was to rock and roll. I mean, it was really a left fork in the road. And part of that was his courage to break a lot of rules. And I've heard Dave say this many times and confirmed by jazz historians. Most records had a really pretty woman on the cover. Dave put abstract art on the cover. Most records had redos of famous musical tunes, something from Broadway that traveled, like, for example, My Favorite Things. Dave did all original music. Part of the reason that expectation was in jazz was purely monetary. Big record companies owned publishing rights. They wanted to make more money by making sure their jazz artists recorded songs that they had the publishing rights. So Dave suffered because he wanted original music. He was economically punished because of that. Still, he had the courage to do it. Third, the original music was in odd time signatures, which no one was doing.
Yeah.
So that was really insane. And then, of course, all great artists, it's a matter of their talent, their convictions, their perseverance, and luck. Because the hand of God intervened, and I'm not saying this from a Billy Graham point of view, but there was a man named Goddard Lieberson who was the president of Columbia Records. This is back in the days, believe it or not, corporate America, when people that ran record companies knew something about music. Maybe they were composers. You know what I mean? They weren't lawyers first or accountants. And Goddard Lieberson's marketing department said, this record will never work. There's no pretty girl. It's original songs, it's odd time signatures. And we don't know what to do with it. We don't even want to put it out. So that record actually sat in the can for a while. And then Goddard Lieberson heard it. He said, I believe there's something special and pioneering and trailblazing about this record, and I think it's going to do big things. So put it out. You figure out how to market it. Give it a chance. And then the rest is, jazz history, what happened.
And every time that May 4th rolls around, 5-4, you always see a picture of Dave Brubeck, because that was one of his key time signatures, was 5-4. It's very hard for me as a pianist to even play because we're so used to 4-4 and 3-4. And I remember one of the first times I heard Dave Brubeck's music, it was a recording, I believe, where he had 3-4 overlaid with 4-4, all at the same time. Yeah. And after so many measures, of course, it comes out. And there is a lot of influence from his music upon your own. And your brother Dan also is a drummer, plays with the Brubeck Brothers Quartet. But your musical beginnings, while you were one of those children of the rock generation, so to speak, you actually did perform with Dave for many, many years as part of the new Dave Brubeck Quartet, I believe, starting in the 70s. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. Well, what happened in terms of my own personal career is I was fortunate enough to be a well-rounded musician. I grew up in a jazz house, hearing lots of jazz. I played in public school bands, picked up the trombone, had my own little rock group called the Vibrations when I was in 7th grade. Then I went to Interlochen Arts Academy, which was serious classical training. At the same time, I met all these people that played viola, but also played rhythm guitar, or violin, but also played lead guitar. So it was this mixture of rock and classics, and we had 2 rock groups called New Heavenly Blue and Sky King. And we toured the country and put out 3 albums that got good reviews and some success. We never had huge commercial success, but like the top 10 and the college album, surveys about what's the hippest thing that's out, that kind of stuff. But after, probably really knocking my head against the wall, doing that for 3 or 4 years, we ran into some interesting, weird political problems. So our deal on CBS was coming to a crashing end. Half the band quit music. They were so discouraged. And my dad saw me, blue about what happened. He said, man, screw rock and roll. Why don't you start playing jazz with me? And I had already played quite a bit with him because we used to tour something called Two Generations of Brubeck. That was Dave's group after the classic quartet with Paul Desmond and Joe Morello broke up. But it was Jerry Mulligan, no flash in the pan, Alan Dawson on drums, Jack Six on bass. And so that group would play. We go to a college like Oberlin. So Dave's group would play and appeal to one demographic. My rock group would play, appeal to another. And then my brother Darius had a group too that Dan was in. So we have like 15 or 16 musicians playing 3 nights in a row. And then finally a promoter said, "Hey, Dave, will you just play a song with your sons? You know, where you just combine the group?" And so we did, and that's when we discovered that there was another level of people like flipping out over that idea, the father playing with his sons. It was like, what's easier, to go on the road with 17 people or 4? And so then we started touring the world as just the 4 of us. It was always in and out, playing with each other's groups, recording, working together. And I'm the son that stayed the longest in Dave's group because I'd sort of done my best to do the rock and roll thing. It didn't work out. I stayed in enough crappy hotels and lousy club gigs. They're like, is that or Carnegie Hall or, you know, whatever.
It's a really hard decision, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah. And so, and I've always played the same bass. I have I wanted to be one of the first rock and roll guys to play a fretless bass, and I was, for whatever that's worth. And I still have the same damn bass from 1969 when there was only 2 fretless basses around. And in fact, Bass Player Magazine just did a feature about my bass and me playing it and the style and the sound of it. And that's what I still play. I take it on the road. In the early days of playing with my dad, good upright bass players with bad pickups, which is all they technically, that sounded less like a bass than my electric bass with a good pickup. Yeah. So everything's evolved, but I'm just so thrilled, and I learned so much playing with my dad, and so did my brother Dan, played a lot, my brother Darius. We even have a younger brother named Matthew, who was 10 years younger than Dan and I, so he kind of missed all that touring kind of stuff. But he's no slouch. He ended up touring with Sheryl Crow for years and the Dixie Chicks, and
you know, that's just a rough life to have to live, isn't it?
It was, because he's 6'8", trying to fit on a touring bus.
Imagine that. So you played with your dad's quartet for nearly 40 years, is that right?
Yeah.
And I know there are several CDs that I recently was given that showcased his solo work, and he lived a good long life.
Amazing.
And from what I understand, he basically was playing until the day he died.
Well, pretty much. I mean, one of the third to last gig he did was actually very poetic, because there's a huge place outside of Chicago called Ravinia. I mean, it's sort of like what Tanglewood is to the Boston Symphony and all that. That's where Ravinia is for Chicago Symphony. And it was on a Father's Day, and they invited Dave to play with me and Dan and Darius, who flew over from Europe, and brother Matthew. And we played, we had a good gig and got a really fine review in the Chicago Sun-Times or whatever. And then there were some things that happened on this gig where, you know, my dad, like, he maybe stumbled or something, but then his leg was really screwed up. And, you know, after a while, we talked with our mom and said, you know, that day that we didn't want ever to happen, I think it's happened, which it's Dave would go out to play, and just something would always go wrong physically, which would mean you're like, okay, now we got to go to the doctor because he bumped his leg. And, you know, it's just the trade-off. It was time, you know, to hang up the gunslinging belt, you know, which we felt bad about, because in a certain way, I've had literally thousands of people saying, I saw your father, you know, maybe in the last 5 years of his performing life. He'd walk out on stage, we'd say, oh my God, we should have seen him 5 years ago, because he's just too old, because he would be walking out very slowly and a little bit hunched over. And then he'd sit down, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, decades melted away, and he played his ass off. Yeah. And so there's a certain amount of like I mean, I do believe there's something mystical going on. When you have, like, you know, 1,500, 3,000 people sending you great energy, like, we love you, Dave, we love your playing, we're sending you beams and good times of happiness to play well. And I think it goes into his body, and it was like, you know, some magic medicine, and he would do it. He would play great. So, you know, once you stop performing, it's like a whole different world. And he would always perform. go through. I don't know if he ever missed maybe one date in his life because he got too sick to play. He's gone out there with mumps. He's gone out there with measles. Never mind in India, the State Department tour in '58. Definitely went out there with dysentery.
That's what you call a team player right there.
That's right, absolutely.
And he's been gone for several years now.
Yeah.
But as we often say, his legacy lives on through not only his recordings, but also yours through the Brubeck Brothers Quartet. And I don't want anyone to get the idea that this quartet simply lives in the shadow of Dave Brubeck, because when you listen to the recordings, they're not just his songs, but your own compositions. In fact, you told me before the interview that each of the members of the quartet do their own share of composing. So tell us sort of how his legacy affects what you do as this new quartet.
Well, the first 3 albums that we did, or CDs, we actually avoided doing any of his tunes because we didn't want people to think that we were only, quote-unquote, writing his coattails. Then, actually, Mike and Chuck, as Dave was obviously not getting any younger, said, you know, we want your dad to really know how much we love his music. Why don't we do a record where we kind of salute his music? And so that was a CD called Lifetimes. And it went over really well. It was number 7 of the most played CDs of that year, of all artists, you know, and I can think of a lot of fantastic artists that were lower down on the chart than us. So obviously what we did really resonated, of doing our own arrangements. The fact that we don't have a sax player in our group makes it very different right away.
Yes.
But it's also true that no one's shared the stage more with Dave Brubeck as a guitarist than Mike D'Amico, because he would play the Detroit Jazz Festival and we'd play there, and then we'd sit in with each other, or sometimes we'd have a gig and he'd come and be our guest, you know. So this cross-pollination was occurring. He's a big fan of Chuck Lambs, our pianist, started out as a drummer and became a pianist. So that fits well into Dave's very percussive, polyrhythmic approach when he's playing too. So when we did that Lifetimes record, we, for example, we did Kathy's Waltz, which was on timeout, and we came up with our own arrangement, and I'm sure we'll play that tonight. I mean, we love playing that tune. It's such a graceful melody. It's so cool. But for example, when we do it, the original quartet version, oddly enough, Kathy's Waltz, most people know that waltzes are in 3/4 time. It always started in 4. For us, by the time we were through screwing around with it, we start out in reggae in 4. But then we end up in a jazz waltz. And actually, the idea of a jazz waltz is a Dave Brubeck innovation, courtesy of Joe Morello. And not to get too technical, but a waltz is like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But Joe Morello started the idea of introducing where the hi-hat goes every other beat. So it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, with the right hand. So that means part of it sounds like 4 underneath the 3 on top. And as a soloist, you can either go ba 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 da ba da ba ba da ba da ba ba da ba da ba ba da ba boo boo da ba do ba do ba do ba da. So both time streams are existing simultaneously, and it's a funny story, but it's absolutely true. How, you know, we intertwine with our dad's legacy. He used to work these clubs in San Francisco and get back at, like, 3 in the morning, and our parents and my mom would say, "Now be quiet, your poor father's got to get some sleep." And they bought us these little cheap, like $20 record players, and we were listening to Disney tunes. And so, like, Dave would hear through the wall, "Someday my prince will come, someday my prince will come," and he's trying to sleep, but it's like permeating in his mind subconsciously. And he goes, "Wow, that's really a hip tune." So Dave was the first person to record "Someday My Prince Will Come" with the jazz waltz beat I'm talking about. Miles Davis goes in and hears Dave playing in a club in San Francisco. Miles Davis's next record is called "Someday My Prince Will Come."
Back in '61, I think.
Something like that. It could be, I think it's probably even earlier than that. But I know that, that kind of funny thing is like, so Dave did this record called Dave Digs Disney. Yes, and it's actually a great record. And Alice in Wonderland, that became a jazz standard too. It was Dave for scat, So it's, in our own weird little way, we were influencing Dave as much as he was influencing us, even when we were children.
And that's just the thing, because in many cases, if a parent is involved with music, a lot of times the children may or may not become involved with music themselves. They may go in a different direction. But for you, that was a mainstay. It was a major influence. But now, here we are in 2019, and we're talking about these songs like Someday My Prince Will Come from Snow White. It's from like 1937, 82 years ago. So my question is, you have these cherished classics, which when you listen to them, they sound as fresh as they did when they were recorded then. But you're also an educator. When the quartet goes to certain cities, sometimes you'll offer workshops for colleges, for jazz students. So how do you take these classics and how do you make them relevant to these up-and-coming students, not just as relics from a bygone era, but something that really is crucial to learning jazz in 2019?
Well, usually what we do is try to emphasize odd time signature playing and polyrhythms. And my brother Dan, he grew up in a very unique situation, like literally sitting on Joe Morello's lap when he was like 3 years old, learning how to hold the drumsticks, hearing Joe Morello play. And Dan has practiced, very disciplined, to be a master of playing polyrhythmically. Like if you hear him play solo on Take 5, like there was a Venezuelan percussionist in the audience last night. I was talking to him after the show, and he was going like, "Oh my God, your brother, do you know he was playing 4 against 5 against 6 against 3 at the same time?" And I said, "Yeah, I know it, because I'm the poor schlub that has to go boom, 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 no matter what he's doing at the same time." And that guy from Venezuela who's a percussionist, he'd be the only person in the audience that knew that he was doing that, But, Dan's got amazing skills. And so we talk to kids, like you said the word relic. As far as I know, they think that I'm a relic, just because I don't like, and I'm sorry, I guess I sound like an old geezer, but I find very little that's appealing about quote-unquote rap music. Sorry, I'm a traditionalist. I think that music implies melody, rhythm, and harmony. And once in a while, if it has lyrics, something clever. Most of the lyrics, there are some guy, Kendrick Lamar, he'll write about stuff that's socially relevant, but a lot of it is boasting below the waist, both sexes, And I just find that, that's old, it's posturing, so what? But it's interesting to think of, like, for example, when I was growing up, New Year's Eve, you'd probably say, "Oh, it's Guy Lombardo, let's go check it out." And like, Guy Lombardo, that music sounds really old and tired to me, right? On the other hand, you go up a generation, and let's say Led Zeppelin was the biggest group, and then you listen to another rock group 20 years later that's really good. There's quite a closer relationship to Led Zeppelin and some other modern rock group, which I couldn't even quite tell you. Occasionally, there's great musicians like a guy like Sting. I love the group The Police. I actually liked his when he started experimenting with jazz artists like Branford and Kenny Kirkland. I actually like the energy of his Police records even better, even though he's playing with great musicians. But we've had the opportunity to meet Sting. He was a huge fan of Dave's. Yeah. Dave's courage helped Sting to be more courageous. Sting started recording tunes in 7 and different time signatures. So we try to bring people up to date, like this idea of time is going to be timeless, no matter what kind of music you make. And if you're going to do, rap music, maybe someone will be hip enough, and maybe someone's done it. I just don't know it. Like, do rap music in 7,
7, 8, yeah.
Why not? It's actually, as I'm a classical composer too, and I find 7 to be a beautiful thing, because I feel like when you're writing in 4, it's just so 4 square. It's like boring architecture, like Quonset huts or whatever. You write in 7, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the 1, 2, 3, the 5, 6, 7. You always sort of launch and ricochet and bounce music off, and it goes in great places. So we do a clinic that emphasizes Dan and I, how we work together as bass player and drummer. And it's one of my favorite things when you meet some kids that maybe did some homework, and then they realize, oh my God, I'm going to have a chance to talk to these guys who actually grew up with one of the greatest jazz drummers of all time, Joe Morello. Yeah. And and you can tell them, and it's a fact. It used to be in Downbeat or Playboy magazine, the Pulse. Who's the killingest drummer right now? Is it Buddy Rich or is it Joe Morello? And it's amazing that we had a unique career, that we were there as literally rugrats crawling around during the rehearsals, to growing up, to being young kids learning to play, to sharing the stage, to playing with them, to recording with them, to touring with them, having our own interactions. And that's just, not many people have that opportunity. It was amazing.
And no, they don't. And here you are offering some of these opportunities through your teaching, through your education to the next generation. And this is clearly a family affair for you, because it all started with your dad.
Yeah.
You and your brother continue it on. So when you look toward the future, is there going to be a third generation possibly that will continue in this legacy?
Well, it's interesting for a variety of reasons. My 3 children have musical abilities, but they chose not to get into music. And Dan's 2 kids have musical abilities, but they're not going that direction. My sister has 3 children. One of them was a daughter named Marielle was singing in a rock group, and I thought she was the best thing about the rock group. But then she walked away from that too. So yeah, there is no big push. And by the way, people always say, "Yeah, well, did your dad really push you?" And I would say, actually, he didn't really push that hard, but he also gave us opportunity. I'm sure there's people that like grew up in a family where there's a family of dentists or something, and the kid might be a real good drummer, and maybe the dentist father would say, "Hey, man, you should go to dental school. I mean, what's this hell?" Like, we never got discouragement at all for wanting to be musicians, but it was always totally clear if we didn't want to be musicians, that's fine. But I remember Dan as a drummer, as a little kid when he was 1 or 2 years old, would pick up a rattle and start using it like a ride cymbal on the edge of his crib. He'd like a stick. My brother Matthew, the youngest one that plays cello, he was whistling melodies before he could talk. So there's some sort of, some gene kind of thing. And also, while we're talking about my parents, our mother, in her own way, was a genius. I mean, literally a very intelligent, bright, lots of brain matter kind of person, but also a complete innovator. If someone ever wrote a book like the most influential women in the business of jazz, my mom would be right up there. It was her idea. I want to get my husband out of these smoky clubs. I want people to hear jazz. And I know it takes more intelligence and listening skills to like it. Sorry to sound like an elitist, and I even like country music, but it's not as intellectually demanding to hear about your wife left you, your tractor broke down, the pickup truck's gone, how drunk are you going to get, whatever, as most jazz tunes, Yes. And so my mom figured out, where are the people that are a little dedicated more to pursuing the intellectual path of life, and they go to college. So she's the one that invented the idea of jazz music coming to college. And she worked so hard on it that she actually even made pamphlets. How do you promote a concert for the Dave Brubeck Quartet? She actually created that sort of sub-industry. And she was a great lyricist, wrote beautiful lyrics for people that sang them, like Louis Armstrong, yes. Carmen McRae. So that was great for me growing up writing rock and roll tunes, because I had the melodic side from my dad, and I had the lyric okay from my mom that it's possible to do this. And so I pursued all this stuff. And then also with my dad, because he worked with Leonard Bernstein, pioneering the idea of jazz with orchestra. Right. So I do lots and lots of compositions where some people call that third stream, where I integrate the two things. And some pieces I've written with Dave together, and that was great fun to work with him on those things. And one of the pieces we did is called Ansel Adams America, and we got permission to project his great black and white monumental photographs above an orchestra, and we wrote a suite to go with it. So that was one of the projects we were really proud. Dave and I had a great relationship that, of course, was just normal sort of father-son stuff. And then when I was in his group for 20 years, people say, "Why do you call your father Dave?" And I said, "Well, it's like the other musicians in the group called him Dave. And when am I going to go, Daddy, do you want me to take the solo?" That sounded stupid. So he became Dave. And then we sort of transcended that to a professional relationship that, I felt more like he was an older brother than a father. Yeah. And I'm saying that in the most complimentary way. There wasn't this father-son dynamic. I never went through a huge revolution. I may have had long hair down to my waist, and he kind of wished that I didn't. Then I look back at pictures, and it's like, son of a gun, his hair's down to his shoulders. What is he talking to me about?
That's right. And you had something a lot of musicians cannot say that they had, especially if their parents were too involved in music. And that was, you had a good close relationship, both personally and professionally.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And my dad was, just a really good guy. Part of it, he grew up as a cowboy. He used to work for $1 a day from sunset to sunrise, or vice versa. And so, he never forgot that. I know the people he liked the best in his life. He didn't socialize a lot, which kind of gave him a bad reputation. With other jazz musicians, they'd go out and they hang out and they go smoking and get drunk and maybe do something else. And Dave was like Mr. Straight Ahead family man, like, Dave, no fun, Mr. Brubeck. He'd go back to his room and start writing religious pieces, oratorios based on biblical texts, and he wrote 18 of those. And name me another jazz musician that did that. Dave had 2 completely different careers.
Yeah. And
as famous as he was throughout the world, not many jazz fans really understood that he had these other abilities. He's one of the leading American composers of quote-unquote classical music.
The things that you learn along the way.
Yeah.
So let's put the focus back on you for our final question, because you've talked about the experiences for you professionally, how you've grown as a musician, how it's impacted your life. But the last question, just 2 simple words. Why music?
I think there's like a broad philosophical answer to this, but I don't think it's a coincidence that Dave and Iola, my parents, had the kids that they had, and 4 of which turned out to be professional musicians. I think we sort of karmically deserved and found each other. I think that's what I was put on this earth to do. And that's what I think happened with Dave and his group. Ultimately, there's a million different ways that led to the point that it led to for them to get known. And I feel like that in the same way I worshipped the Beatles when I was in 7th grade. Like, how was it that John, Paul, George, and Ringo all got together? It's like the music angels had a beautiful conspiracy to make these guys' creativity mesh, plus George Martin, don't forget him. Yes. And I feel that's the same with Joe Morello, Paul Desmond, Dave Brubeck, and Eugene Wright, my musical uncles. If you're really lucky, all these the musical angels come together with your hard work and your talent, and your career just goes nuts if it's the right time. And that's not to say there weren't groups just as good that just never came together. But sometimes there's a beautiful conspiracy for good things to happen. Obviously, we live in a time when there's wonderful conspiracies for bad things to happen. But I hope to God that the better angels amongst us all will ultimately, end up taking over everything. When I worked with Dave, I play at many of the premieres of his religious works. And you see a chorus. There's 150 people singing this beautiful music. And then you have the orchestra and you have the audience. And I often walk away saying, like, when God created the human race, that's what he thought he was going to get. This beautiful spirit of high art and cooperation. And we still got it. We just have to somehow let all the other forces that want to suppress and hijack that, when it gets to politics, when I think I'm totally turned off, I can't stand to hear one more person from either party spout any BS. I hear a speech. I go like, oh my God, that was beautiful. Yeah. I still remember JFK at the convention when I was like, an 8-year-old kid. It totally inspired me. Obama was first in line when it came to who's giving out oratory skills. Or you could say, Janis Joplin for white girls with great blues voices. She was first in line in that department. I mean, everybody on this planet, almost everybody, has like a gift of some sort, and hopefully they can share. And we've been very fortunate to be born in this family and share this music, and have so many people come backstage afterward and say, "Oh man, I loved your dad, but I see it reflected in you, and we love this music, and we're so glad that you're continuing. And we had the best teachers in the world. Why shouldn't we continue? We're lucky we're here doing it."
Chris Brubeck, our guest for In Studio from Simply Timeless. For more information on the Brubeck Brothers Quartet, visit the website BrubeckBrothers.com. Special thanks to Chris for taking the time to meet with me before our recent concert with the quartet in Hopewell, New Jersey. Until next time, I'm Jay Daniels, thanking you so much for joining us in studio.